To understand the madness of San Simeon, you first have to understand the geography of loneliness. If you drive north from Los Angeles along the Pacific Coast Highway, past the mansions of Malibu and the piers of Santa Barbara, the world begins to change. The civilization falls away. The road clings to the edge of the continent, suspended between the violent blue of the Pacific Ocean and the golden, sunburnt slopes of the Santa Lucia Mountains. It is a landscape of terrifying beauty, windswept, empty, and primal. For most of American history, this stretch of coast was a blank spot on the map. It was too rugged for farming, too isolated for industry, and too wild for cities. It was the edge of the world. But if you look up, high above the fog line, perched on a crest that the locals call the Enchanted Hill, you will see something that defies logic. You will see a cathedral. You will see twin bell towers rising in the Spanish style, shimmering like a mirage against the stark California sky. This is not a house. To call Hearst Castle a house is like calling the RMS Titanic a boat. It is a private nation-state. It is a city built by one man, for one man, in the middle of nowhere. It contains 165 rooms, 127 acres of gardens, and 2 swimming pools that rival the baths of ancient Rome. It was once home to the world's largest private zoo, where polar bears panted in the California heat and zebras grazed alongside cattle. But this palace was not built by a king, and it was not built by a government. It was built by a newspaper publisher. It stands as the ultimate monument to the American ego, a physical manifestation of the idea that with enough money you can bend reality to your will. You can import European history, stone by stone, and reassemble it on a cow pasture in the Wild West. However, before the stone and before the gold, there was just the dirt. The story of Hearst Castle does not begin with William Randolph Hearst. It begins with the man who dug the fortune out of the ground, his father, George Hearst. George Hearst was the archetype of the American prospector. He was a rough, illiterate, tobacco-chewing man who walked across the plains in 1850 with nothing but a pickaxe and a hunch. He didn't care about art. He didn't care about architecture. He cared about the earth and what was hidden inside it. And George Hearst had a supernatural talent for finding money. He struck silver in the Comstock lode. He struck gold in the Homestake mine in South Dakota. He struck copper in the Anaconda mine in Montana. He didn't just become rich, he became a titan. By the 1860s, he was one of the wealthiest men on the planet. His fortune was blood and earth money, pulled from the dark veins of the American frontier. With this limitless wealth, George did what rich men of his era did. He bought land. In 1865, he purchased a 40,000-acre ranch in San Simeon, California. He didn't buy it for the view. He bought it for the cattle. It was a working ranch, a place of dust and cowboys. Over the years, he kept buying. He bought the next ranch over and the one after that. Eventually, the Hearst dominion stretched over 250,000 acres. It was a kingdom of grass and coastline, roughly half the size of Rhode Island. George Hearst had a son, William, and this is where the genetic tragedy of the dynasty begins. George was a man of the earth. William was a man of the clouds. Born in 1863, William Randolph Hearst was a soft, pampered, and intensely intelligent child. He had no interest in mining. He had no interest in the brutality of digging holes in the ground. He was interested in the world of illusions. The pivot point, the rosebud moment of this story, happened in 1873. When William was 10 years old, his mother, Phoebe Hearst, took him on a grand tour of Europe. Phoebe was the opposite of George. She was cultured, refined, and obsessed with education. She wanted to wash the dust of the mines off her son and dip him in the waters of the old world. For 18 months, the 10-year-old boy and his mother traveled through the capitals of Europe. They visited the Louvre in Paris, the Uffizi in Florence, and the castles of the Rhine Valley in Germany. Most 10-year-old boys would have been bored. William was possessed. He didn't just look at the castles, he studied them. He collected tickets, he collected menus, and he bought cheap porcelain souvenirs. He began to develop a mania for collecting that would eventually consume his life and his fortune. He walked through the great halls of kings and emperors, looking at the tapestries and the armor, and a dangerous idea began to form in his young mind. He realized that history was something you could own. If you had enough money, you didn't have to just visit the museum. You could live in it. He returned to America with a vision burned into his retinas, the vision of a castle on a hill. But he had to wait. He had to wait nearly 50 years. In the intervening decades, William Randolph Hearst grew up. He took his father's money and built a media empire that terrified the establishment. He created yellow journalism. He started wars to sell papers. He ran for political office. He became a figure of immense, terrifying power in New York and San Francisco. He was the Jeff Bezos and the Rupert Murdoch of his day combined into one looming 6'3" frame. Yet, despite living in the finest penthouses in New York, his heart remained in San Simeon. He loved the ranch. It was the only place where he felt truly free. Every summer, he would escape the boardrooms and the newsrooms and retreat to the wild coast of California. But there was a problem. The ranch at San Simeon had a main house, a Victorian structure down by the water, but William hated it. He preferred the top of the mountain, a place called Camp Hill. It was a windswept, treeless peak with a view that stretched to infinity. For years, Hearst would bring his entourage of Hollywood stars and editors up to Camp Hill for glamping trips. But this wasn't ordinary camping. Hearst was a man of excess. He set up a tent city that looked less like a campsite and more like the field headquarters of a Napoleonic army. There were separate tents for sleeping, dining, and lounging. The tents had wooden floors, Persian rugs, and full-sized beds. Servants in tuxedos would trudge up the dirt road to serve champagne on silver trays, while the wind howled outside canvas walls. It was absurd, and as Hearst got older it became intolerable. He was a large man, prone to comfort, and by 1919 he was 56 years old. He was tired of sleeping in a tent. He was tired of walking to an outhouse in the rain. 1919 was a pivotal year. It was the year his mother, Phoebe, passed away. This event is crucial because Phoebe controlled the purse strings. George Hearst had left the fortune to his wife, not his son, fearing William's reckless spending. When Phoebe died, the dam broke. The trust funds unlocked. William Randolph Hearst suddenly had access to the full, unmitigated torrent of the family wealth. He was 56, he was fabulously rich, and he was done with tents. He decided it was time to build the dream he had been harboring since he was 10 years old. He went to San Francisco to find an architect. He could have hired anyone. He could have hired the great architects of New York, McKim, Mead, and White, or the designers of the skyscrapers rising in Chicago. He was a man who lived in a world of men. His newspaper empire was a boys' club of cigar smoke and whiskey. But William Randolph Hearst did something that shocked his contemporaries. He didn't hire a man. He hired a tiny, soft-spoken, 47-year-old woman named Julia Morgan. Julia Morgan was a unicorn in the early 20th century. She was the first woman ever admitted to the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. She was the first woman licensed as an architect in California. She was brilliant, she was a workaholic, and she stood barely 5 feet tall. On the surface, they were the oddest couple in American history. On one side you had Hearst, a bombastic, loud, towering tycoon who threw money around like confetti and changed his mind every 5 minutes. On the other side, you had Morgan, a quiet, disciplined, unmarried woman who wore tailored suits and lived for her work. But Hearst chose her for a specific reason. Other architects had egos. They wanted to build their asterisk vision. Julia Morgan was a listener. She understood that Hearst didn't want a piece of modern art. He wanted a stage set. He wanted a container for his obsession. The meeting where the castle was born has become legendary. Hearst walked into her office in San Francisco one afternoon in 1919. He sat down, perhaps looking a bit sheepish, and uttered the most famous understatement in architectural history. "Miss Morgan," he said, "I'm getting a little old and cranky, and I'm tired of going up to the ranch and sleeping in tents. I would like to build a little something." A little something. He originally described a bungalow, maybe a few guest cottages. A nice main lodge with a fireplace where he could read his papers away from the wind. It was supposed to be a retirement project, a modest vacation home on the hill. Julia Morgan, with the patience of a saint, agreed to take the job. She looked at the site plans. She looked at the difficult terrain, a mountain peak with no water, no roads, and no electricity, located miles from the nearest railhead. It was a logistical nightmare, but she saw the potential. She began to sketch. At first, the drawings were modest, but something happened once the pencil hit the paper. The collection mania that Hearst had suppressed for years began to bleed into the project. He started sending her notes. Maybe we could make the main room a little bigger. Maybe we could add a tower. I just bought a ceiling from a church in Spain. Can we fit that in? The little something began to mutate. It grew from a bungalow into a hacienda, then from a hacienda into a mansion, and finally from a mansion into a cathedral. Hearst didn't just want a house. He wanted a La Cuesta Encantada, the enchanted hill. He wanted a Mediterranean village perched on the California coast. He wanted it to look like it had been there for centuries, a place that had been built by Romans, occupied by the Spanish, and renovated by the Renaissance. He wanted to compress 2,000 years of European history into a single structure. Julia Morgan didn't blink. She didn't tell him it was impossible. She didn't tell him that hauling tons of limestone up a dirt goat track was insanity. She simply nodded, rolled up her sleeves, and prepared to go to war with the mountain. As the 1920s roared into existence, the trucks began to roll. The dynamite began to blast the top off the camp hill. The cowboys on the ranch stopped herding cattle and started watching the caravans of art arrive. The neighbors, what few there were, watched in disbelief. A city was rising in the wilderness. The fog was lifting, and the castle was beginning to take shape. But no one, not even Julia Morgan, knew that this was just the beginning. They weren't just building a house. They were building a trap. A golden, velvet-lined trap that would eventually consume the fortune, the reputation, and the sanity of the man who ordered it built. The tent was coming down. The Xanadu was going up. And the madness of William Randolph Hearst was about to be carved in stone. To build a castle in the sky, you need two things: infinite money and infinite patience. William Randolph Hearst had the money. He did not have the patience. He was a man of impulses, a creature of immediate gratification who viewed the laws of physics as mere suggestions that could be negotiated away with a checkbook. He wanted the castle, and he wanted it now asterisk. For any ordinary architect, working for Hearst would have been a career-ending nightmare. He was the client from hell. He would demand a wall be built on Tuesday, look at it on Wednesday, decide he hated the shadow it cast, and order it sledgehammered on Thursday. He had no concept of structural engineering or the linear passage of time. He treated stone and steel like they were ink and paper, things that could be edited, erased, and rewritten on a whim. To tame this beast, it required a specific kind of genius. It required Julia Morgan. If you walk into the visitor center at San Simeon today, you will see photos of her. She looks deceptively fragile. She is small, often wearing a sensible skirt suit, round glasses, and a hat pulled low. She looks like a librarian. But make no mistake, Julia Morgan was the steel spine of the entire operation. In the hypermasculine world of the 1920s construction industry, where worksites were rough, swearing, tobacco-spitting environments, this tiny woman was the undisputed alpha. She was the first woman to survive the grueling architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, a place that had actively tried to haze her out because of her gender. She had endured hazing, isolation, and the scorn of the European elite to earn her degree. A difficult client like Hearst didn't scare her. She understood him. She realized early on that Hearst was not a builder. He was a collector. He viewed the castle not as a home, but as a scrapbook, and she was the glue. The partnership began in earnest in 1920, and the first challenge was not the house. It was the hill. The enchanted hill rises 1,600 feet above the ocean. At the time, the only way up was a cow path that turned into a mudslide when it rained and a dust bowl when it didn't. You cannot build a palace if you cannot get the marble up the mountain. Morgan didn't just design the house. She engineered the infrastructure of a small country. She surveyed and built a 5-mile road of switchbacks that snaked up the canyon. It was a feat of civil engineering that rivaled the construction of an Alpine pass. But the road was just the artery. She needed blood. The hill had no water. A castle needs fountains, pools, and bathrooms. Morgan scoured the mountains, hiking miles into the backcountry in her skirt and boots, until she found natural springs on the slopes of Pine Mountain, 5 miles away. She designed a gravity-fed aqueduct system that piped the water across the jagged terrain to a massive reservoir on the hilltop. Before a single chandelier was hung, Julia Morgan had essentially terraformed the landscape. Then the construction of the little something began. Hearst's initial instruction to build bungalows was technically followed, but in the Hearst lexicon, a bungalow is a relative term. He ordered 3 guest houses to be built first, to give him a place to stay while the main house was constructed. He named them Casa del Sol, House of the Sun, Casa del Monte, House of the Mountain, and Casa del Mar, House of the Sea. These cottages are larger than most American mansions. Casa del Sol alone is 18 rooms of opulence, and it was here, in the construction of these guest houses, that the architectural style of San Simeon was defined. It is a style that defies categorization. It is technically Mediterranean revival, but that is too polite. It is despot chic. Hearst and Morgan developed a technique that was revolutionary for its time. While the castle looks like it is made of ancient stone, it is actually a fortress of reinforced concrete. Morgan was a pioneer in the use of reinforced concrete, partially because she was obsessed with earthquakes. She had opened her office in San Francisco just 2 years before the 1906 earthquake flattened the city. She had seen buildings crumble. She vowed that her castle would never fall. So the walls of San Simeon are thick, steel-laced concrete, faced with white limestone to give the illusion of antiquity. It is a modern bunker wearing a Renaissance costume. This allowed Morgan to do things that stone masons couldn't. She could hang balconies over cliffs. She could create soaring towers that would have collapsed if they were made of traditional brick. As the guest houses rose, the Titan began to shop. And this is where the story shifts from engineering to mania. William Randolph Hearst went on a shopping spree that has no parallel in the history of consumerism. He didn't shop for sofas at a department store. He shopped for history. He bought entire collections from bankrupt European aristocrats. He bought medieval choir stalls from churches in Italy. He bought Gothic tapestries from France. He bought statues from Egypt. But his favorite thing to buy was ceilings. Hearst would walk into a monastery in Spain that was falling into disrepair. He would look up at the intricate, hand-carved teak ceiling dating back to the 15th century. He would say, "I'll take it." His agents would then pay the monks, build scaffolding, dismantle the ceiling beam by beam, pack it into numbered crates, put it on a steamship to New York, put it on a train to Los Angeles, put it on a truck to San Simeon, and haul it up Julia Morgan's road. Julia Morgan would then receive a telegram from Hearst that read something like, "Have purchased 15th century Mudéjar ceiling. Dimensions are 20 feet by 40 feet. Please build a room to fit it." This is the reverse of how architecture works. Usually you design a room and then build a ceiling to cover it. At Hearst Castle, the artifacts dictated the architecture. Morgan had to design the Casa Grande, the main house, as a jigsaw puzzle. She had to create spaces that could accommodate a fireplace from a French chateau, a door frame from a Spanish convent, and a ceiling from an Italian palazzo, all in the same room, and make it look cohesive. It was an improvisational jazz performance in stone, and the speed was relentless. Hearst owned the media, so he had a telegraph ticker installed on the hill. He would sit in his construction tent, reading news wires from around the world, firing off editorials to his papers, and then walking outside to yell at a foreman about the placement of a window. By 1922, the Casa Grande was rising. It was modeled on a Spanish cathedral in Ronda, but inflated to the scale of a government building. The twin bell towers began to scrape the sky. The facade was a riot of religious iconography, saints, virgins, and martyrs, decorating the home of a man whose only religion was power. The logistics of the hilltop became a spectacle in themselves. A camp of hundreds of workers lived on the summit. There were stone masons from Italy, woodcarvers from Switzerland, and labourers from Mexico. It was a Tower of Babel. The noise was deafening, the roar of rock crushers, the shouting of foremen, the hammering of steel. And in the middle of it all walked Julia Morgan, inspecting the pour of the concrete, climbing the scaffolds, and translating Hearst's chaotic dreams into blueprints. She was the only person who could tell him no. When Hearst wanted to place a massive, heavy fireplace on a floor that couldn't support it, Morgan wouldn't argue about aesthetics. She would argue about math. She would show him the load calculations. She spoke the one language he respected: facts. But even Morgan couldn't stop the expansion. The plan changed weekly. Hearst would wake up in the middle of the night with a new idea. Let's add a wing here. Let's put a library there. The blueprints were never finished. They were just current drafts. As the structures grew, the madness of the collection began to arrive by the truckload. The road up the mountain became a conveyor belt of priceless art. There are stories of crates sitting unopened for years because Hearst had bought so much he forgot what he owned. He had warehouses in the Bronx and San Simeon filled to the rafters. It was hoarding on a Rockefeller scale. One famous anecdote from this era encapsulates the madness. Hearst bought a medieval Spanish monastery in the province of Segovia, the monastery of St. Bernard de Clairvaux. He bought the asterisk entire building. He had it dismantled, stone by stone, and shipped to America. The crates arrived in New York, but by then he had run out of money or interest, or perhaps Morgan told him there was no room on the hill. The stones were quarantined by the Department of Agriculture because the packing hay might contain hoof-and-mouth disease. The stones were unpacked, burned, and then repacked in random boxes. The monastery was never reassembled at San Simeon. It sat in a warehouse for decades. It was eventually rebuilt in Miami in the 1950s, a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. This was the energy of Act II. It was a time of pure, unadulterated dopamine. The money was flowing, the concrete was pouring, and the castle was rising. Hearst was the titan, throwing lightning bolts of cash, and Morgan was the architect, weaving them into a structure that would withstand the ages. But as 1924 approached, the camping phase was over. The main house was habitable, the furniture was moving in, and with the furniture came the people. The isolation of the construction site was about to be shattered by the arrival of the Hollywood circus. The architect had built the stage, now the actors were coming, and the Enchanted Hill was about to become the most exclusive and the most scandalous club in the world. The concrete was dry. The show was about to begin. By the mid-1920s, the Enchanted Hill had ceased to be a construction site and had become a pilgrimage. The road up the mountain, painstakingly engineered by Julia Morgan, was no longer just a path. It was a highway for the impossible. It wasn't just limestone and concrete moving up the grade anymore. It was the plunder of Europe. To understand the sheer scale of Act III, you have to visualize the logistics. Imagine a single, winding dirt road, precarious and steep, servicing a project that required the resources of a small war. Every single nail, every bag of cement, every beam of steel had to be hauled 40 miles from the nearest railhead in San Luis Obispo to the coastal hamlet of San Simeon, and then dragged 1,600 feet into the clouds. William Randolph Hearst had built a private pier at the base of the mountain to receive shipments by sea. The scene at the dock was a surreal juxtaposition of the mundane and the majestic. You would see crates of Campbell's soup sitting next to crates containing 16th century Flemish tapestries. You would see sacks of cattle feed stacked against a disassembled Roman temple. Hearst's appetite for features was insatiable. He didn't just want a fireplace, he wanted the asterisk fireplace. He bought the great cloisters fireplace from a castle in France, a massive Gothic stone structure so large you could roast an ox in it. When it arrived, it was too big for the room Julia Morgan had designed. In a normal world, you return the fireplace. In Hearst's world, you tear down the room. This became the defining rhythm of the construction. Asterisk build, destroy, rebuild. Hearst was a perfectionist, but he was a perfectionist who thought in real time. He couldn't visualize blueprints. He had to see the thing built. He would order a wall to be erected. The masons would spend weeks cutting the white stone, mixing the mortar, and laying the blocks. Hearst would arrive on the weekend, look at it, and say, "It's too close to the path. Move it 4 feet back." On Monday morning, the sledgehammers would swing. The wall would come down, the rubble would be cleared, and the masons would start again. There are walls at San Simeon that were built and demolished 3 or 4 times before Hearst was satisfied. To the workers, it was madness. To Julia Morgan, it was Tuesday. Morgan managed this chaos with a supernatural calm. She acted as the buffer between Hearst's whims and the workers' sanity. When Hearst demanded that a pair of antique Spanish towers be made taller after they were already built, Morgan didn't scream. She used hydraulic jacks to lift the entire roof structure and inserted new blocks underneath. She treated stone like it was Lego. But the most famous example of building the impossible was the Great Assembly Room asterisk. This was the heart of the Casa Grande, a room meant to rival the great halls of medieval kings. It was 100 feet long, enormous in scale. Hearst had purchased a set of choir stalls from a cathedral in Catalonia, Spain. These were heavy wooden seats where monks would sit during prayer. Hearst wanted them to line the walls of his living room. The problem was that the room was also supposed to hold his tapestries and his statues and the massive teak ceiling he had bought. The sheer weight of the objects in this room required the floor to be supported by steel trusses worthy of a railroad bridge. Then came the jigsaw puzzle. Hearst had bought a French Gothic fireplace that was ancient and priceless. He wanted it to be the centerpiece, but he also had a collection of oversized silver candlesticks. When placed on the mantel, they looked too small, so Hearst ordered the floor of the fireplace raised. Then the fireplace looked too high, so he ordered the ceiling raised. Every adjustment rippled through the entire structure. Raising a ceiling meant extending the steel columns, which meant changing the roofline, which meant altering the exterior towers. A whim about a candlestick could cost $50,000 in structural changes. And then there were the trees. Hearst loved nature, but he loved nature on his terms. He decided that the stark, grassy hilltop was too barren. He wanted a forest, but he didn't want to plant saplings and wait 20 years. He wanted a forest now asterisk. He ordered the transplantation of fully grown California live oaks. These are massive, gnarled trees weighing hundreds of tons. Moving a 30-foot oak tree up a mountain is a feat of engineering that borders on the absurd. Workers had to dig around the roots of ancient oaks found in the valleys below, encase the root ball in a massive wooden box, and then use cranes and trucks to haul the living tree up the switchback road. They planted thousands of them. But the asterisk piece de resistance of botanical madness occurred when Hearst decided a particular oak tree was in the wrong spot. It was a massive, centuries-old tree that stood right where he wanted a path. Most men would cut the tree down. Hearst refused. He loved the tree. So he ordered Julia Morgan to move it. Not move it across the yard. Move it out of the way, but keep it alive. The cost of moving this single tree was roughly equivalent to the cost of building a middle-class home. They dug under it, jacked it up, built a railway track under the roots, and rolled the tree a few feet to the left. The tree survived. It stands there today, a living testament to the fact that William Randolph Hearst refused to compromise with reality. Inside the house, the collection was getting out of hand. Hearst was buying faster than Morgan could build. The warehouses were overflowing. He began to store art in the basement, then in the guest cottages, then in the unfinished wings. He bought a collection of ancient Greek vases, pottery from 500 BC. He had so many of them that he lined the tops of the bookshelves in the library with them. In any museum, these would be behind glass in a climate-controlled case. At San Simeon, they were decorations, exposed to the open air and the dust. He bought medieval banners and hung them from the ceiling of the dining room, the refectory. These were flags that had been carried into battle in the 14th century. They hung above the ketchup bottles on the dining table, slowly disintegrating in the sunlight. This cavalier attitude toward conservation horrified the art world, but it delighted Hearst. He didn't want a museum where things were dead behind glass. He wanted to live with the history. He wanted to eat his breakfast eggs while looking at a tapestry woven for a king. He wanted to flick his cigar ash into a tray that might have been used by a Roman senator. The tension of Act III is the tension of the budget. Even for a man as rich as Hearst, this level of construction was a drain. The cost wasn't just the materials, it was the labor. He had a standing army of artisans on the payroll for decades. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the tearing down of walls and the moving of mountains, something miraculous was happening. The castle was becoming beautiful. Julia Morgan was succeeding. She was taking this chaotic pile of loot, the choir stalls, the ceilings, the fireplaces, the statues, and she was weaving them into a cohesive whole. She used the white stone to tie it all together. She used light and shadow. She designed tiles that bridged the gap between a Spanish door and an Italian window. The main building, Casa Grande, began to look like a dream. The twin towers rose into the fog, tipped with colored tiles that caught the sunset. The terraces stepped down the mountain, lined with marble statues. It was a chaotic mix of styles, yes, but it worked. It felt ancient. It felt like a fortress that had guarded the coast for 1,000 years. By the end of this era, the physical structure was mostly there. The concrete had set, the trees were rooted, the water was flowing, the stage was set, but a stage is empty without a leading lady. Hearst had a wife, Millicent, who lived in New York. She was a refined society woman who had borne him 5 sons, but she belonged to the East Coast. She belonged to the respectable world. San Simeon was not respectable. It was the Wild West. And so, as the dust settled on the construction site, a new figure entered the story. A woman who would become the queen of this castle. A woman who was loud, funny, drunk, and absolutely devoted to Hearst. Her name was Marion Davies, and when she arrived, the Enchanted Hill stopped being a construction project and started being a party. The golden age of San Simeon was about to begin. By the late 1920s, the stone skeleton of the Casa Grande was complete, rising from the dry dust of the Santa Lucia Mountains like a white hallucination. But William Randolph Hearst wasn't satisfied with stone. Stone is static. Stone is dead. He wanted life. He wanted movement. And in the searing heat of the California coast, where the summer sun bakes the grass into golden straw, the ultimate symbol of life is water. Most men who build on a mountain top are content with a view of the ocean. Hearst decided to bring the ocean up the hill. This act of the story focuses on the 2 greatest swimming pools ever constructed in the Western Hemisphere. They are the defining images of Hearst Castle, the postcards, the symbols of the estate. But to simply call them pools is an insult to engineering. They were aquatic cathedrals, and true to the rhythm of the Enchanted Hill, they were born through a process of agonizing destruction and rebirth. The outdoor pool, known as the Neptune Pool, is perhaps the most famous body of water in architectural history. But the pool you see today, the massive marble-lined lagoon that stretches 104 feet long, was not the first draft. It wasn't even the second. It was the third. The first Neptune Pool, built in 1924, was a modest affair. It was Temple Garden style, brick-lined and relatively small. Hearst swam in it. He liked it. But then his collection mania kicked in. He bought a massive shipment of white Vermont marble. He looked at his small pool, decided it was unworthy of the marble, and ordered it destroyed. Julia Morgan, ever the stoic, brought in the jackhammers. They smashed the brick. They dug the hole deeper. They expanded the footprint. This was the second Neptune Pool. It was grander with concrete steps and statues. It was a beautiful pool. It would have satisfied any emperor. But then Hearst went shopping again. He bought the facade of an ancient Roman temple. It featured 6 massive marble columns, pediments, and statuary. It was a ruin dating back to the glory days of the empire. He shipped it to San Simeon. When the crates arrived, he had a realization. The temple needed to be the backdrop of the pool, but the pool was too small to frame the temple. So he ordered it destroyed. Again. The third and final construction of the Neptune Pool was a project of pharaonic scale. The previous pool was gutted. The mountain itself was reshaped to accommodate the new footprint. The basin was lined with white Vermont marble, which gives the water a brilliant, refracting turquoise quality that looks almost radioactive in its purity. To heat this massive volume of water, nearly 350,000 gallons of it, Morgan installed a terrifying system of oil-burning boilers. The pool was kept at a comfortable temperature year-round, steaming in the cool coastal fog. But the genius of the Neptune pool is not just the water, it is the frame. Morgan installed the Roman temple facade at one end, creating a theatrical stage set. But she didn't stop there. She surrounded the pool with colonnades, rows of marble pillars that define the space without enclosing it. Walking onto the terrace of the Neptune pool is a disorienting experience. You are standing in ancient Rome, looking at white marble columns and statues of Venus. But when you look through the columns, you don't see the Italian countryside. You see the wild, rugged coast of California dropping away into the Pacific Ocean miles below. It is a visual collision of two worlds. It is the ultimate infinity pool, suspended between the history of the old world and the wilderness of the new. If the Neptune pool was the temple of the sun, a place of light, exposure, and parties, the indoor pool was the temple of the moon. It was a place of shadows, silence, and mystery. Hearst decided he needed an indoor pool for the days when the fog was too thick or the weather too cold. But he didn't want a gymnasium. He wanted a grotto. He wanted a space that felt like a hidden sea cave discovered beneath a Byzantine palace. The Roman pool took nearly 7 years to build. It is located under the tennis courts, buried in the earth like a bunker. When you enter the room, your eyes have to adjust. It is dark. The air is still and smells faintly of chlorine and ozone. As the shapes resolve, you realize you are standing inside a jewelry box. Every inch of the room, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the pool basin itself, is covered in mosaic tiles. There are over 1 million tiles in this room. They are made of Murano glass, imported from Venice, Italy. They are not just blue. They are a spectrum of blues, from deep oceanic indigo to pale cerulean. But the real magic is the gold. Scattered among the blue tiles are thousands of gold tiles. These are not painted. They are fused gold, a layer of 24-karat gold leaf sandwiched between 2 layers of clear glass. When you turn on the lights, the room doesn't just brighten, it glows. The gold tiles catch the reflection of the water and shimmer. The ceiling is arched, covered in mosaics of sea monsters, mermaids, and stars. It feels like swimming inside the night sky. The silence in the Roman pool is heavy. The acoustics are resonant, amplifying every splash. Morgan designed a shallow end and a deep end, which plunges to 10 feet, and she included a diving platform hidden in the artificial rocks. But she also included something stranger. Surrounding the pool are 8 marble statues of Roman gods and heroes. They stand in alcoves, watching the swimmers. They are copies of famous ancient statues, carved in Italy. But in the dim blue light, they look like sentinels. There is a pervasive rumor, one of the many legends of the castle, that this pool was rarely used. Guests found it spooky. It was too beautiful, too quiet, too intense. It felt less like a recreational facility and more like a site for a ritual. While the Neptune pool was full of laughing movie stars and splashing children, the Roman pool often sat empty, a silent, glittering cavern of blue and gold, waiting for a bather who felt worthy enough to disturb the water. But water was not the only element Hearst wanted to control. He wanted to control nature itself. He wanted to be a knower. In a letter to Julia Morgan, Hearst casually mentioned that he wanted to build a zoological garden. In reality, he built the largest private zoo on the planet. This wasn't just a few peacocks strutting on the lawn. This was a full-scale menagerie that rivaled the San Diego Zoo. Hearst wanted his guests to feel like they were on a safari, but a safari where the animals were part of the decor. He divided the zoo into 2 parts. The first was the field animals. These were the herbivores. He fenced off 2,000 acres of the hillside with high, heavy-gauge wire. Into this enclosure, he released a Noah's Ark of grazing beasts. Imagine driving up the winding road to the castle in your Duesenberg convertible in 1930. As you round a curve, you have to slam on the brakes because the road is blocked by a herd of zebras. You look to your left and see a flock of ostriches sprinting through the California oak trees. You look to your right and see camels, llamas, yaks, and kangaroos. There were herds of tar goats from the Himalayas, sambas from India, and audads from North Africa. At its peak, the hillside was teeming with over 100 species of exotic herbivores. They weren't in cages. They were roaming free, creating a surreal landscape where the African savanna was superimposed onto the American West. But Hearst had a darker fascination. He loved the predators. The second part of the zoo was the menagerie. This was a series of cages and pits located closer to the main house. Here he kept the killers. He had lions. He had tigers. He had leopards, jaguars, and cougars. He had a specific obsession with bears. He had black bears, grizzlies, and sun bears. But the crown jewels of the collection were the polar bears. Keeping polar bears alive in San Simeon, where summer temperatures can reach 100 degrees, was a logistical nightmare. Julia Morgan had to design special enclosures with pools of constantly circulating water. The bears were fed blocks of ice to keep them cool. The feeding of the zoo was an industrial operation. A dedicated staff of zookeepers worked round the clock. Trucks arrived daily filled with bales of hay, crates of lettuce, and massive sides of raw beef for the carnivores. Hearst loved his animals with a possessive intensity. He would often take his guests for walks through the menagerie. He had a favorite leopard named Tu that he would sometimes walk on a leash, though stories of this vary in their veracity, the image persists. But a private zoo is a dangerous thing. The animals were wild. There were incidents. A zebra bit a guest. A monkey escaped and terrorized the kitchen staff. The roar of the lions could be heard from the bedrooms at night, a primal sound mixing with the crashing of the Pacific waves. One terrifying story involves a guest who got drunk and decided to feed the bears. He climbed over the safety rail and was reportedly pulled back just in time by a security guard. The line between the enchanted hill and a death trap was often thinner than the guests realized. By the mid-1930s, the transformation was complete. Stand on the terrace of the Casa Grande in 1935 and look around. To your left, the Neptune pool glows turquoise in the sun, framed by Roman columns. Below you, zebras graze on the golden hills. Behind you, hidden in the earth, the Roman pool glitters in the dark. William Randolph Hearst had done it. He had taken a dry, dusty, lonely mountain peak and turned it into a functioning paradise. He had bent the elements to his will. He had piped the water, planted the trees, imported the stone, and caged the beasts. It was a world without context. It was a place where time and geography didn't exist. You could swim in Rome, walk through Africa, and sleep in Spain all before lunch. But a paradise needs inhabitants. A stage set needs a play. The infrastructure was ready. The pools were filled. The lions were fed. And now the invitations were in the mail. The Camp Hill was gone. The castle was open. And the most famous people in the world were about to board the private train from Los Angeles, heading for a weekend at the ranch where the only rule was, don't talk about death and don't bring your own liquor. The Golden Age had arrived. Imagine it is a Friday afternoon in 1935. You are one of the most famous people on earth. Perhaps you are Charlie Chaplin or Clark Gable or Winston Churchill. You have received an invitation that is not really an invitation. It is a summons. The heavy cream-colored stationery, embossed with the Hearst crest, has arrived at your studio or your embassy, and you have cancelled your plans. You are going to the ranch. The journey to San Simeon was a ritual of transition, a slow shedding of the real world. It began at Glendale Station in Los Angeles, where you boarded a private train often hired exclusively for Hearst's guests. The train would wind its way north along the coast, a rolling cocktail party of the Hollywood elite, moving through the orange groves and the oil fields, leaving the smog of the city behind. You disembarked at San Luis Obispo, miles from civilization, where a fleet of limousines was waiting. These cars would carry you another 40 miles up the rugged, empty coastline until you reached the iron gates at the bottom of the mountain. There, you would transfer again, this time into a taxi or a sturdy ranch car for the terrifying, ear-popping ascent up the 5 miles of switchbacks that Julia Morgan had carved into the rock. As the car climbed above the fog line, the air changed, the light changed, and suddenly the castle would loom above you, a white city in the clouds. When you stepped out of the car onto the gravel of the main terrace, you were no longer in America. You were in Hearst's America. You had entered a sovereign nation where the laws of the United States were suspended and replaced by the whims of one man. This act is the story of the lifestyle inside the castle. It is the story of the parties that defined the golden age of Hollywood. But underneath the champagne and the laughter, it is the story of a prison. It was a beautiful prison, lined with velvet and gold, but it was a prison nonetheless. The warden of this prison was William Randolph Hearst, but the social director, the heart, and the soul of the castle was Marion Davies. To understand the dynamic of San Simeon, you have to understand Marion. History, and specifically the movie Citizen Kane, has been unkind to her. It painted her as a talentless, screeching, drunk mistress who was forced down the throat of the American public by her rich boyfriend. This is a lie. The real Marion Davies was a comedic genius, a woman of immense warmth, generosity, and wit. She was the glue that held the castle together. Hearst was the chief, the terrifying titan who would sit in the corner and watch. Marion was the little gold digger, a nickname she used ironically, the one who made sure everyone had a drink, the one who defused the tension, the one who wasn't afraid to tell the old man he was being boring. They were a scandalous couple. Hearst was still married to his wife, Millicent, who lived in New York and refused to grant him a divorce. So, for 30 years, Hearst lived openly with his mistress. At San Simeon, Marion was the queen. She occupied the celestial suite on the top floor of the Casa Grande, right next to Hearst's Gothic suite. They lived in sin above the heads of the most conservative figures in American politics. The guest list at the castle was a kaleidoscope of power. On any given weekend, you might find George Bernard Shaw arguing about socialism with Calvin Coolidge. You might see Cary Grant playing tennis with the mayor of New York. You might see Greta Garbo hiding behind a pillar in the Neptune pool. It was the only place in the world where the spheres of politics, literature, and cinema collided so violently. But they were all there to perform. An invitation to San Simeon was a job interview. If you were an actor, you needed Hearst's newspapers to mention your name. If you were a politician, you needed his endorsement. If you were a writer, you needed his syndication. Everyone was singing for their supper. And the supper came with rules. The paradox of Hearst Castle is that it looked like the wildest party in the world, but it was run like a boarding school. Hearst was a Victorian moralist at heart. He didn't like loose morals, despite living with his mistress. He didn't like dirty jokes, and most specifically, he didn't like drunks. Rule number 1, the one-drink rule. William Randolph Hearst hated alcoholism. He had seen it destroy his friends, so he imposed a strict limit on alcohol consumption. Cocktails were served strictly between 7:00 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. in the assembly room. You could have 1 martini, maybe 2 if you drank fast. But once the gong rang for dinner, the bar was closed. No wine was served at the table. No brandy was served after dinner. For the hard-drinking Hollywood set of the 1930s, this was torture. And so, a massive, underground smuggling operation developed. Guests would pack their trunks with bottles of gin and scotch wrapped in sweaters. They would smuggle flasks in their boots. David Niven, the famous British actor, later told stories of the prohibition at the castle. He described how the servants, who were loyal to Marion, not Hearst, would help the guests hide the booze. Marion herself was a heavy drinker, a functioning alcoholic who used liquor to cope with the boredom and the pressure of being the Titan's companion. She had a special system. She would hide bottles of gin in the toilet tank of her bathroom. She would hide flasks inside hollowed-out books in the library. There is a famous story of Harpo Marx arriving at the castle with pockets full of silverware and booze, clanking as he walked, mocking the absurdity of the rules. Hearst knew, of course. He had spies everywhere. If a guest became visibly intoxicated, they weren't yelled at. They would simply find a note under their door the next morning saying that a car was waiting to take them to the train station. It was the San Simeon banishment. You were exiled from paradise, usually forever. Rule number 2, mandatory attendance. You could sleep all day, you could ride the horses, you could swim in the pools, you could play tennis, but you had asterisk to be at dinner, and you had to be on time. The nightly ritual of the castle was theatre. It began in the assembly room, the massive main hall with the puzzle ceiling and the overstuffed sofas. Guests would gather for the brief cocktail hour. This was the moment of high anxiety. Who was in favour? Who was out? Hearst would emerge from a hidden door in the wood panelling, a literal secret passage from his office, and descend upon the room. He was a large man, with a high, reedy voice that sounded like a flute coming out of a tuba. He would circulate, shaking hands, checking the attendance. Then the gong would sound. The procession would move into the refectory, the dining room. This room is the visual definition of the high and low aesthetic of San Simeon. The walls were lined with medieval choir stalls. Silk banners from the Palio horse race in Siena hung from the ceiling. The table was a massive slab of oak. The silver was antique. But on the table, amidst the 17th century candlesticks, sat clusters of Heinz ketchup bottles, jars of pickles, and bottles of A1 steak sauce. There were paper napkins. This was Hearst's Camp Hill affectation. He insisted on calling the castle the ranch. He wanted to pretend they were still camping in tents. He wanted the food to be simple: pheasant, chicken, steaks, served with common condiments. It was a power move. Only a man this rich could serve ketchup in a room worth $10 million. It signaled that he didn't care about the rules of polite society. He made the rules. Marion sat at the middle of the long table opposite Hearst. She was the conductor. If the conversation dragged, she would crack a joke. If Hearst started to monologue about politics, she would interrupt him. She was the only person on earth allowed to interrupt him. She would say, "Oh, Pops, stop it, you're boring everyone." And the terrifying Titan would just smile. He adored her. Rule number 3, no death. This was the strangest and most strictly enforced rule of all. William Randolph Hearst was terrified of mortality. He forbade the mention of death in his presence. You could not talk about funerals. You could not talk about illness. If a palm tree in the garden turned brown, the gardeners were instructed to paint the leaves green until it could be replaced in the middle of the night. He wanted the castle to be a place of eternal youth, a neverland where the flowers never died and the party never ended. After dinner, the ritual continued. The group would move to the private theatre. It was plush, red, and lined with golden caryatids. Every single night, a movie was shown. Usually it was a film produced by Hearst's studio, Cosmopolitan Productions, often starring Marion Davies. Hearst would sit in the front row, in a special chair equipped with a telephone so he could call his editors in London or New York in the middle of the film. The guests had to sit and watch. You couldn't leave. You couldn't talk. You had to watch Marion Davies in * Little Old New York for the 10th time. Before the feature, there was always a newsreel. Hearst Metrotone News *. It was propaganda, pure and simple. It showed the world as Hearst wanted it to be seen. It showed him meeting dictators, presidents, and kings. It reinforced the idea that the man sitting in the front row was the architect of history. But as the lights went down in the theatre, the cracks in the golden cage became visible. The lifestyle at San Simeon was exhausting. It was a performance that never ended. Marion Davies, despite her smile, was trapped. She had given up her own career to be his hostess. She was a talented comedian, but Hearst insisted on casting her in weepy, dramatic costume dramas that bored the audience. He tried to buy her stardom, and in doing so, he ruined her reputation. She drank to escape. He watched her like a hawk. He was insanely jealous. He had private detectives follow her. He monitored her phone calls. The celestial suite was not just a bedroom, it was a panopticon. There is a darkness that hangs over the parties of the mid-1930s. The outside world was falling apart. The Great Depression was ravaging America. People were starving in the streets of Los Angeles. But up on the enchanted hill, the orchestra played on. The polar bears were fed prime cuts of beef while men stood in breadlines. The castle became a symbol of out-of-touch arrogance. To the struggling masses, Hearst wasn't a hero. He was a villain. He was hoarding wealth in a fortress while the country burned. And then there was the Thomas in C affair. This is the ghost story of the Hollywood set. In 1924, the movie mogul Thomas in C died after a weekend party on Hearst's yacht, the Wanada *. The official cause was heart failure, but the Whisper network of Hollywood told a different story. They whispered that Hearst had caught Marion Davies kissing Charlie Chaplin. They whispered that Hearst had pulled a gun. They whispered that he shot at Chaplin, missed, and hit Thomas in C. Was it true? Almost certainly not. The historical evidence suggests in C really did die of natural causes. But the fact that people believed *, it tells you everything you need to know about the reputation of the castle. People believed that Hearst was so powerful, so above the law, that he could shoot a man in the head and cover it up. They believed that the police, the coroner, and the press were all in his pocket. The rumor hung over the castle like a fog. It added a layer of menace to the parties. When you went to San Simeon, you were entering the lair of a man who could supposedly get away with murder. By the late 1930s, the party was beginning to sour. Hearst was getting older. His heart was weakening. The walks through the zoo became shorter. The movies in the theater became louder as his hearing failed. The one-drink rule became harder to enforce as Marion's alcoholism deepened. The golden cage was locked tight, but the key was about to be stolen. For decades, Hearst had used his newspapers to destroy people. He had ruined politicians, actors, and rivals with the power of his printing presses. He believed he was immune. He believed he was the one who told the stories. But a young, brash, genius filmmaker named Orson Welles was about to prove him wrong. He was quietly writing a script. He wasn't writing about a fictional character. He was writing about the castle. He was writing about the mistress. He was writing about the sled. The biggest threat to San Simeon wasn't the earthquake or the fire or the depression. It was a movie. And when Citizen Kane was released, it would shatter the walls of the Enchanted Hill more effectively than any dynamite Julia Morgan ever used. The secrets of the Golden Cage were about to be projected onto every screen in America. By 1940, William Randolph Hearst believed he was untouchable. He sat atop his Enchanted Hill, 76 years old, the ruler of a private nation-state that was guarded by 3 distinct layers of defense. First, there was the geography, the 5 miles of treacherous switchbacks that separated him from the common man. Second, there was the private army, the security guards, the cowboys, and the gatekeepers who ensured that no subpoena server or unwelcome guest could ever cross the threshold. And third, and most importantly, there was the silence. Hearst controlled the microphone of America. He owned 28 major newspapers. He owned magazines like Cosmopolitan and Harper's Bazaar *. He owned radio stations. He owned a movie studio. For half a century, he had decided what was news and what was not. If he wanted to destroy a man, he printed the story on the front page. If he wanted to erase a man, he simply ordered his editors to never type the name again. He believed he owned the narrative of his own life. But he made a fatal error. He forgot that the most dangerous spies are not the ones climbing over the fence. They are the ones you invite to dinner. The destruction of William Randolph Hearst's reputation and the permanent rebranding of his castle did not come from a rival tycoon or a politician. It came from a 25-year-old boy genius named Orson Welles and a washed-up, alcoholic screenwriter named Herman Mankiewicz. To understand the betrayal, you have to look at Mank. Herman Mankiewicz was a regular at San Simeon. He was exactly the kind of guest Hearst tolerated but didn't respect. He was brilliant, witty, cynical, and a catastrophic drunk. He was the court jester. He sat at the long table in the refectory, drinking the illicit gin he smuggled past the butler, eating the pheasant and watching. He watched the way Hearst dominated the room. He watched the sad, desperate drinking of Marion Davies. He watched the jigsaw puzzles scattered on the tables, the endless, pointless hobby of a bored couple. He watched the vast, cavernous fireplaces and the echoing silence of the halls, and he took mental notes. When Mankiewicz teamed up with Orson Welles to write the screenplay for a project tentatively titled American Asterisk, he poured all of it onto the page. They changed the names, but they didn't change the soul. William Randolph Hearst became Charles Foster Kane. Marion Davies became Susan Alexander. And San Simeon, the Enchanted Hill, became Xanadu. The script was an autopsy of a living man. It depicted Kane not as a great leader, but as a hollow, lonely hoarder who buys statues to fill the void where his heart should be. It depicted his mistress not as a talented comedian, but as a screeching, talentless opera singer whom Kane forces the public to applaud. But the most devastating weapon in the script was a single word: Rosebud. To the public, Rosebud was just a sled, a symbol of lost childhood. But inside the gates of San Simeon, the word was a nuclear bomb. According to the dark whispers of Hollywood, whispers that Mankiewicz knew well, Rosebud was the intimate, private pet name that Hearst used for a specific part of Marion Davies' anatomy. By making Rosebud the central mystery of the film, Welles and Mankiewicz were playing a joke so cruel, so invasive, and so humiliating that it is hard to comprehend the sheer audacity of it. They were taking the old man's deepest intimacy and projecting it onto a 30-foot screen for the world to laugh at. In early 1941, the rumor mill began to churn. Hearst heard that RKO Radio Pictures was making a movie about him. He didn't take it seriously at first. He was the king. Who would dare? Then came the screening. Orson Welles made a mistake. He screened a rough cut of the film for a select group of insiders. One of them was Louella Parsons. Louella was not just a gossip columnist. She was Hearst's gossip columnist. She was his enforcer in Hollywood. She owed her career to him. She walked into the screening room expecting a drama. She walked out shaking with rage. She realized immediately what she had seen. She saw the castle, the Gothic fireplace, the zoo, the no trespassing sign. She saw the jigsaw puzzles. She saw the sad, drunk mistress. It wasn't a fiction, it was a documentary disguised as a dream. She ran to the phone and called San Simeon. When Hearst received the news, the Enchanted Hill went to war. For the first time in the history of the estate, the mood shifted from festive to martial. Hearst didn't sue for libel. That would only draw attention to the similarities. Instead, he used the brute force of his monopoly. He issued a directive to every newspaper and radio station he owned. No mention of RKO Pictures. No mention of Orson Welles. No mention of Citizen Kane. He didn't just ban ads for the movie. He banned ads for any Asterisk movie made by the studio. He tried to starve them out. But he didn't stop there. He went after the industry itself. The studio heads of Hollywood, Louis B. Mayer of MGM, Jack Warner of Warner Bros., were terrified of Hearst. They relied on his newspapers to sell their tickets. Hearst sent his agents to them with a threat that was dark and ugly. He threatened to expose the private lives, the affairs, and the Jewish heritage of the studio bosses in a series of scathing editorials if they allowed the movie to be released. The panic in Hollywood was total. Louis B. Mayer, the most powerful man in the film industry, made an offer to RKO. He offered to pay them $842,000, the entire cost of the film's production plus a profit, if they would hand over the negative and all the prints so he could burn them. Think about that. The leaders of the film industry were willing to destroy what is now considered the greatest movie ever made, just to appease the old man on the mountain. They wanted to conduct a ritual sacrifice of art to save their own skins. RKO refused. The movie was released in May 1941. Hearst's boycott was effective. In many cities, theaters refused to show it, fearing the wrath of the local Hearst paper. The movie failed to make a profit. It was a box office disappointment. Hearst thought he had won. He sat in his theater at the castle, watching his newsreels, believing he had crushed the upstart. But he was wrong. You can kill a movie's box office, but you cannot kill its truth. Citizen Kane did something that no editorial or lawsuit could ever do. It stole Hearst's identity. Before 1941, San Simeon was known as a triumph of architecture, a place of mystery and glamour. After 1941, it was Xanadu. It was the costly pile of junk. It was the monument to loneliness. The film reframed the public's perception of the castle. They no longer saw the zoo as a delightful menagerie. They saw it as a prison for beasts. They no longer saw the vast collection of statues as a sign of culture. They saw it as the hoarding of a man who couldn't love people, so he loved stone. The physical reality of the castle was overlaid with the fictional reality of the movie, and the fiction was stronger. But the true casualty of the war was Marion Davies. The character of Susan Alexander Kane, the screeching, untalented, alcoholic second wife, became the lens through which the world viewed Marion. It was a lie. Marion Davies was a delightful comedian, a savvy businesswoman, and the only person who truly loved Hearst. But Citizen Kane stripped her of her dignity. It turned her into a punchline. Hearst was devastated by this. He had skin as thick as a rhinoceros when it came to attacks on himself, but attacks on Marion broke him. He felt he had failed to protect her. The walls of the castle, the guards, the money, none of it could stop the flickering image on the screen. There is a legendary story, perhaps apocryphal but spiritually true, that Orson Welles visited San Francisco on the night of the premiere. He found himself in an elevator at the Fairmont Hotel. The doors opened, and William Randolph Hearst was standing there. Welles, young and arrogant, reportedly smiled and said, "Mr. Hearst, would you like tickets to the premiere of Citizen Kane?" Hearst stood in silence. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He simply waited for the doors to close, leaving Welles alone. Whether that meeting happened or not, the silence was real. The party at San Simeon began to die. The release of the movie coincided with a darker turn in history. Pearl Harbor was attacked just months later. The United States entered World War II. The lights along the California coast were blacked out to prevent Japanese submarines from shelling the shore. For the first time in 20 years, the castle went dark. The floodlights that illuminated the towers were cut. The Neptune pool was drained or covered. The zoo animals were thinned out. The private trains stopped running. The war for Xanadu had left deep cracks in the foundation. Hearst had spent millions building a monument to his own immortality, and Orson Welles had turned it into a tombstone while he was still alive. The psychological walls of the castle had been breached. The enchanted hill was no longer a fairy tale. It was a tragedy. And as the war raged overseas, a different kind of war came to the gates of San Simeon. This wasn't a war of words or film. It was a war of dollars. The one thing William Randolph Hearst never thought he would run out of was money. He was wrong. The creditors were coming up the hill, and they didn't care about the view. The foreclosure of Xanadu had begun. The year was 1937, and the most dangerous sound on the enchanted hill was not the roar of the lions in the zoo, nor the crashing of the Pacific waves against the pier. It was the ringing of the telephone. For decades, William Randolph Hearst had treated money as an abstract concept, a magic fluid that flowed endlessly from the ground. He had inherited the earth from his father, the miner, and he had spent it like a man who believed the vein would never run dry. But mathematics is a cruel god, and eventually the ledger always balances. To understand the sheer magnitude of the collapse that was about to happen, you have to look at the numbers. By the late 1930s, William Randolph Hearst was in debt to the tune of $87 million. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $1.8 billion today. This wasn't investment debt. This wasn't money borrowed to build factories or expand infrastructure. This was consumer debt. It was money spent on tapestries, on polar bears, on masquerade balls, on castle walls, and on maintaining a media empire that was bleeding cash in the middle of the Great Depression. He was spending money at a rate that defied comprehension. He bought newspapers that lost money just because he liked their editorial page. He kept a private train on standby. He employed a personal staff of thousands. And he built. He never stopped building. Even as the banks were sending warning letters, he was ordering Julia Morgan to tear down the grand staircase and move it 5 feet to the left. The House of Cards began to wobble in the summer of 1937. The Canadian newsprint manufacturers, The men who supplied the paper for his empire demanded payment. They were owed millions. They threatened to cut off the supply. Without paper, there are no newspapers. Without newspapers, there is no cash flow. The board of directors of the Hearst Corporation panicked. They looked at the books and realized the emperor had no clothes. They realized that the richest man in the world was technically insolvent. They went to the banks for a loan to save the company, but the banks refused. They had seen the spending. They knew about the castle. They told the board, "We will not lend you a dime as long as that man is in charge of the checkbook." The coup was swift and brutal. William Randolph Hearst, the man who had started wars and made presidents, was stripped of his financial power. Control of his empire was handed over to a trustee, a terrifyingly pragmatic judge named Clarence Sheehan. Judge Sheehan did not care about art. He did not care about architecture, and he certainly did not care about the enchanted hill. He looked at San Simeon and saw a black hole. He saw a financial tumor that was sucking the life out of the corporation. The regime of the accountants descended upon the castle. For 20 years, the hill had been a place of yes. Now, suddenly, it was a place of no. Hearst was put on an allowance. It was a humiliation that is hard to overstate. The man who had spent millions on a whim was now forced to ask permission to buy a crate of lettuce for the zebras. He was told he could not make long-distance phone calls. He was told to fire the staff. The construction site, which had been active every single day since 1919, went silent. The hammers stopped ringing. The stone masons put down their chisels. Julia Morgan, who had dedicated her entire professional life to this project, was told to stop. There was no money for concrete. There was no money for steel. The north wing of the castle, the massive new addition that was supposed to complete the courtyard, was abandoned. It stands there today, a ghost structure. You can see the exposed steel beams, the raw concrete, the unfinished walls. It is a frozen moment in time, a physical testament to the day the money ran out. But stopping the spending wasn't enough. The debt was too high. The banks demanded liquidation. They needed to turn the junk back into cash. And so began one of the most tragic and surreal yard sales in history. The accountants went through the warehouses. They went through the Bronx storage facility. They went through the basement of San Simeon. They catalogued the hoarding of a lifetime. They found crates that had never been opened. They found Egyptian sarcophagi. They found entire suits of medieval armor. They found silver services for kings who had been dead for 500 years, and they put price tags on them. The sale didn't happen at Christie's or Sotheby's. That would have been too dignified. In a final insult to Hearst's ego, the collection was sold at Gimbel's department store in New York. Imagine walking into a department store in 1941 to buy a toaster and finding yourself in the basement surrounded by the treasures of the Hearst collection. You could buy a 16th century Spanish refectory table for a few $100s. You could buy a suit of armor for the price of a tailored suit. It was a fire sale. The International Studio Art Corp., a shell company set up to manage the liquidation, flooded the market. Art historians wept. Collections that should have been in the Louvre were broken up and sold to dentists in New Jersey for decoration. But the most heartbreaking liquidation happened on the hill itself. The accountants looked at the zoo. A private zoo is an absurdity in a bankruptcy hearing. It costs a fortune to feed a lion. It costs a fortune to cool a polar bear. Judge Sheehan ordered the zoo to be dismantled. The menagerie was broken up. The lions and tigers were crated and shipped to public zoos in San Francisco, San Diego, and Los Angeles. The polar bears were taken away from their marble-lined pools. The monkeys were caught and caged. But the field animals, the herbivores roaming the 2,000 acres, were a different problem. You cannot easily catch a herd of wild zebras on a mountainside. You cannot simply round up 50 Himalayan tars that have learned to climb the cliffs. Many of the animals were caught and sold, but many were simply left. The gates were opened, or the fences fell into disrepair, and the animals drifted into the wilderness. The zebras, in particular, proved impossible to eradicate. They went feral. To this day, if you drive along Highway 1 near San Simeon, you can still see the descendants of Hearsts, zebras grazing on the hillsides, a living, breathing glitch in the California ecosystem, a stripe of black and white in a world of green and gold. As the walls closed in, William Randolph Hearst sat in his Gothic suite, an old man watching his kingdom being dismantled piece by piece. He was 75, then 76, then 77. His heart was failing. His gait was unsteady. The world expected Marion Davies to leave. She was the gold digger, after all. That was the narrative. She was there for the money, for the parties, for the fame. Now that the money was gone and the parties were over and the fame was curdling into infamy thanks to Citizen Kane, surely she would pack her bags and return to Hollywood. She did the opposite. This is the moment where the script of Citizen Kane and the reality of life diverge violently. In the movie, the mistress leaves the tycoon, shrieking that she never loved him. In reality, Marion Davies saved him. When the cash crunch was at its absolute worst, when the banks were threatening to foreclose on the castle itself, Marion Davies walked into Hearst's office. She didn't ask for money. She opened her purse. Over the years, Hearst had given her jewelry, real estate, and stocks. She had invested wisely. She was a rich woman in her own right. She took out her checkbook and wrote a check to William Randolph Hearst. The amount is debated by historians. Some say it was $1 million, some say it was $2 million. But the act is undisputed. She liquidated her own assets, her jewelry, her stocks, to save his. She handed him the money and told him to keep the castle. She told him, "I don't need it, you need it." It was an act of staggering loyalty. The bimbo, the drunk, the mistress proved to be the only person in his life who wasn't there for the payout. She bought him time. She bought him a few more years on the hill. She bought him his dignity. But you cannot buy health. By 1947, William Randolph Hearst was 84 years old. He was a shadow of the Titan. His heart was fibrillating. He required constant medical attention. San Simeon is a terrible place to be sick. It is an hour from the nearest hospital. The high altitude, the isolation, and the sheer size of the place made it dangerous for an invalid. The doctors gave him an ultimatum: leave the hill or die on it. Hearst wanted to die on it. He wanted to be buried in the garden next to his dogs. He wanted to stay in his Gothic suite, looking out at the ocean until the lights went out. But Marion and the doctors overruled him. They told him he had to move to Los Angeles, to a house in Beverly Hills where he could be close to specialist care. The morning of his departure, May 2, 1947, is the most cinematic scene in the history of the estate. The castle was quiet. The construction noise had stopped years ago. The zoo was empty. The pools were still. Hearst walked out of the Casa Grande for the last time. He was dressed in his suit, leaning heavily on a cane, flanked by Marion and his nurses. He walked down the steps of the terrace, past the marble statues he had bought in Rome, past the Neptune pool that Julia Morgan had built 3 times for him. He got into the car. As the driver started the engine, Hearst spoke. He didn't ask to go to the airport. He didn't ask to go to the station. "Drive slowly," he said. "I want to see it one more time." The car wound its way down the 5 miles of switchbacks. At every curve, the castle appeared and disappeared, playing peekaboo through the oak trees. It rose white and shimmering against the blue sky, the twin towers standing like sentinels. Hearst pressed his face against the glass. He was weeping. He knew he would never come back. He knew that the thing he had spent 30 years building, the thing he had poured his soul and his fortune into, was finished for him. He was leaving his body behind. When the car reached the bottom of the hill, he didn't look back. The iron gates closed. The enchanted hill was no longer his home. It was just a property on a ledger. The final years in Beverly Hills were a sad epilogue. Hearst lived in a mansion on North Beverly Drive with Marion by his side. She nursed him. She sat with him. She kept the world at bay. He died on August 14, 1951. And the moment his heart stopped, the machinery of the Hearst Corporation, The sons, the executives, the lawyers roared into action. What happened next was a final act of brutality toward Marion Davies. She had been his companion for 32 years. She had saved him from bankruptcy. She had nursed him on his deathbed. But she was not his wife. According to the accounts of the day, Marion was sedated by a doctor, some say at the family's request, to calm her grief. While she was asleep, the Hearst executives arrived at the house. They didn't just take the body, they took everything. They removed his personal effects. They removed his papers. They removed any trace of his life. When Marion woke up, groggy and heartbroken, she was alone. The body was gone. The family had taken him to San Francisco for a funeral to which she was not invited. She was erased. In the official obituaries, she was barely mentioned. The family closed ranks. They wanted to rewrite history. They wanted to pretend that the 30 years at San Simeon, the parties, the laughter, and the love affair had never happened. They wanted to return him to the bosom of respectability. Back at San Simeon, the castle stood empty. The staff was let go. The furniture was covered in white sheets. The water in the Neptune pool grew still. The question that hung over the estate was the same question that hangs over every great ruin. What do we do with it? It was too big to sell. Who would buy a house with 165 rooms in the middle of nowhere? It was too expensive to maintain. The tax bill alone was crippling. The Hearst Corporation didn't want it. It was a drain on their profits. The family didn't want it. It was a monument to their father's infidelity and madness. For years it sat there. The fog rolled in and out. The zebras grazed on the lawn. The dust settled on the 15th century ceilings. It seemed destined to follow the path of so many other Gilded Age mansions, slow decay followed by the wrecking ball. But the ghost of Julia Morgan was built into the walls. She had built it out of reinforced concrete. She had built it to withstand earthquakes. She had built it to last forever. The house refused to fall down. It stood on the hill, stubborn and white, waiting for a new owner. The family tried to donate it to the University of California. The university said no, it was too expensive. They tried to donate it to the county. The county said no. Finally, in a desperate move to get the tax write-off, the Hearst Corporation approached the state of California. They offered a deal. We will give you the house. We will give you the art. We will give you the hilltop. But you have to figure out how to pay for the light bulbs. The state hesitated. It was a massive liability. It was a white elephant of epic proportions. But they looked at the numbers. They looked at the tourism potential. They realized that this wasn't just a house. It was American history frozen in amber. In 1957, the papers were signed. The iron gates were unlocked. The private drive was open to the public. The enchanted hill ceased to be the private domain of a tycoon and became a state historical monument. The king was dead. The mistress was exiled. The accountants had fled. And now the tourists were coming. The final act of the castle's life was about to begin. It was about to become a museum of itself. The morning of June 2, 1958, marked the end of the American monarchy and the beginning of the American Museum. On that day, the iron gates at the bottom of the enchanted hill, which for 40 years had been locked against the world, swung open. But this time, no limousines glided through. There were no Duesenbergs carrying Charlie Chaplin, no private taxis carrying Winston Churchill, and no delivery trucks carrying polar bears. Instead, there was a yellow school bus. The state of California had taken possession of the keys, and with the bureaucratic efficiency of a government agency, they began to process the public. Tickets were sold for $2. The common man, the very demographic William Randolph Hearst claimed to champion in his newspapers but excluded from his life, was finally allowed to ascend the throne. The bus ride up the 5 miles of switchbacks was a revelation. For decades, the castle had been a rumor, a white shape glimpsed from the highway, a cloud-shrouded mystery where the gods of Hollywood drank forbidden gin. Now, as the bus groaned up the incline, passing the empty lion cages and the overgrown pergolas, the mystery began to dissolve into reality. When the first tourists stepped off the bus onto the gravel terrace, the culture shock was absolute. They were wearing polyester slacks and holding Kodak cameras, standing in a plaza designed for Renaissance princes. They pressed their noses against the glass of the assembly room. They walked in silence through the refectory, looking at the ketchup bottles that had been glued to the table as permanent exhibits. It was a jarring collision of eras. The castle had ceased to be a home. It had become a specimen. The no-death rule was gone. The house itself was now a mausoleum. The silence that Hearst had cultivated was replaced by the drone of tour guides reciting facts about square footage and gold leaf. The Enchanted Hill was now State Historical Monument number 775. But buildings, like people, have a second act. And Hearst Castle's second act would prove to be just as dramatic, violent, and expensive as its first. The first challenge was not preservation, it was security. In the 1970s, the castle became a symbol not of wonder, but of excess. The radical politics of the era viewed San Simeon as a temple of capitalist oppression. It was the physical embodiment of the wealth gap. In February 1976, the violence arrived. A bomb exploded at the castle. A device was planted at the guest house known as Casa del Sol. The blast tore through the structure, shattering windows, destroying antiques, and ripping a hole in the ceiling. It was an act of domestic terrorism, likely linked to the radical groups that had kidnapped Hearst's granddaughter, Patty Hearst, 2 years earlier. The bombing was a wake-up call. The castle wasn't just a pile of old rocks, it was a political target. The state realized that they were guarding a polarizing icon. The security protocols were tightened. The open house atmosphere was replaced by metal detectors and bag checks. The innocence of the 1958 opening was lost. The castle was once again a fortress, but this time it was protecting itself from the public, not the banks. Then came the true enemy, nature. William Randolph Hearst had spent millions trying to tame nature, but nature plays the long game. The salt air of the Pacific Ocean is a slow acid. It eats limestone, it corrodes iron, it rots velvet. The state of California found itself fighting a war of attrition against the elements. A peculiar orange lichen began to grow on the white stone facade of the Casa Grande. It spread like a rash, turning the gleaming white towers a rusty, sickly color. Conservationists were paralyzed. If they scrubbed the lichen off, they risked damaging the soft stone beneath. If they left it, the castle looked abandoned. They had to develop a chemical cocktail specifically designed to kill the lichen without hurting the architecture. It was a microscopic war fought inch by inch. But the greatest test of Julia Morgan's genius came on December 22, 2003. At 11:15 a.m., the San Simeon earthquake struck. It was a magnitude 6.5 temblor, centered just miles from the castle. The ground didn't just shake, it convulsed. The energy released was equivalent to a nuclear weapon detonating underground. Inside the castle, the tour groups were thrown to the floor. The sound was deafening, the roar of the earth mixing with the crashing of 1,000 priceless objects. In the libraries, the ancient Greek vases that Hearst had casually placed on the shelves danced towards the edge. In the assembly room, the massive chandeliers swung like pendulums. But outside, the real drama was in the structure. This was the moment of truth. This was the moment Julia Morgan had prepared for 80 years earlier, when she insisted on using reinforced concrete instead of brick, when she insisted on steel cages inside the towers, when she over-engineered the foundations to an obsessive degree. She was preparing for this exact second. The castle groaned, the towers swayed, but they did not fall. When the dust settled, the damage was cosmetic, not structural. A few urns had fallen. Some tiles had popped off the ceiling of the Roman pool, but the Casa Grande stood firm. The concrete bunker disguised as a palace had survived. It was a posthumous victory for the tiny, quiet architect. She had built a building that could punch back at God. However, the 21st century brought a new threat, one that concrete couldn't fix: drought. The water that Julia Morgan had piped from the mountains began to run dry. California entered a historic, punishing drought. The natural springs that fed the estate dwindled to a trickle. The state faced a public relations nightmare. How could they justify keeping 345,000 gallons of water in the Neptune pool while local farmers were letting their crops die of thirst? They couldn't. In 2014, the decision was made to drain the Neptune pool. For the first time in 80 years, the blue water vanished. The pool became a vast, empty concrete scar. It was a shocking sight. Tourists who had traveled thousands of miles to see the famous infinity pool found themselves staring into a dry, cracked pit. It looked like a ruin from a fallen civilization. It looked like the end of the dream. The emptiness of the pool revealed the fragility of the entire enterprise. Without the water, the Roman temple looked fake, a prop on a soundstage. The glamour evaporated. The castle looked old, tired, and thirsty. But the emptiness was also an opportunity. The state launched a massive restoration project. They realized the pool had been leaking, losing thousands of gallons a day into the mountain. They stripped the basin down to the bedrock. They replaced the plumbing. And in a move that would have made Hearst proud, they replaced the marble. They went back to the original quarry in Vermont. They found the same vein of white marble that Hearst had used in the 1930s. They cut thousands of new tiles. It cost $10 million. It took 4 years. In August 2018, the valves were opened. The water returned. It wasn't just water, it was a resurrection. As the turquoise level rose, reflecting the white columns and the blue sky, the soul of the castle returned. It proved that even in an era of scarcity, we still need our monuments to excess. We still need to believe in the mirage. And then pop culture returned to the hill. In the decades since Citizen Kane, the castle had been culturally frozen. But in 2014, the singer Lady Gaga negotiated a deal to film her music video for GUY on the estate. It was a surreal moment. The grandchildren of the one-drink rule generation watched as pop dancers in latex writhed by the Neptune pool. Hearst would have hated it. He hated vulgarity. But in a strange way, it was a return to form. The castle was built for performance. It was built for spectacle. Whether it was Marion Davies in a hoop skirt or Lady Gaga in wings, the architecture demanded a show. The castle devoured the attention. It trended on social media. It became a background for selfies. The enchanted hill had successfully migrated from the newsreel to the TikTok feed. As we stand at the end of the story, looking back at the legacy of William Randolph Hearst, we are left with a complicated ledger. He was a man who got everything he wanted and nothing he needed. He wanted to be president. He failed. He wanted to be loved by the public. He was feared. He wanted to control the narrative of his life. He lost it to a 25-year-old filmmaker. But he built the house. San Simeon is the only thing that truly survived him. His newspapers are mostly gone or diminished. His political influence is a footnote in history books. Citizen Kane is remembered as a masterpiece, but it is a fiction. The castle is the fact. It stands today as the ultimate paradox of the American dream. It is a place of breathtaking beauty that feels profoundly lonely. It is a place built for friends that is now walked by strangers. It is a museum of European history that is uniquely, violently American. If you drive down Highway 1 tonight and you look up at the Santa Lucia Mountains, you might see a light. The state keeps the towers illuminated. It looks like a spaceship landed on the ridgeline. And if you look closely at the hillsides near the highway, you will see the ghosts. The zebras are still there. There is a herd of over 100 of them, wild and free, grazing on the California grass. They are the living descendants of the madness. They shouldn't be there. They belong in Africa. But they are there because one man, a century ago, pointed a finger and said, "I want them." They are the final, living proof of the power of the will. They are the heartbeat of the estate. William Randolph Hearst died believing he had failed. He died in a borrowed house, exiled from his hill, stripped of his power. But he was wrong. He didn't fail. He achieved the only kind of immortality that actually exists. He built something that we cannot stop looking at. He built a little something that became everything. He built a trap for time, and inside the walls of the Casa Grande, time is still caught. The ketchup bottles are still on the table. The water is still blue. The gold still glitters in the Roman pool. And somewhere in the shadows of the Gothic suite, the presence of the Titan still paces the floor, waiting for the guests to arrive, waiting for the movie to start, waiting for the one thing he could never buy, an ending that he could control. But the ending belongs to us now. The gates are open. The bus is waiting. The enchanted hill belongs to the world. This has been the Manor Files.